Good morning. Greetings from downtown Washington, D.C. We're going to wait a few seconds for people to join, but I already see some attendees joining. Welcome to the event, Science and Technology at the World Bank, Recommendations to President Ajay Banga. My name is Estefania Ortiz Galva, Senior Program Manager at the AAAS Center for Science Diplomacy and Editorial Manager at Science and Diplomacy. First, I'll provide some housekeeping rules. I'll introduce our moderator, and then I'll handle the floor to him. Kindly note that this webinar is being recorded. It has captions enabled. Over the coming days, we'll upload the recording at the AAAS.org page where the registration for the event was hosted. We'll also share this recording with everyone who registered to attend. We want to hear from you, so please submit any questions that you have for our speakers using the Q&A feature. The chat is also enabled, so feel free to use it for comments. The webinar is organized by the Center for Science Diplomacy at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a multidisciplinary general scientific society founded in 1848 with members around the globe. AAAS is a non-governmental organization based in Washington, D.C. And the center is the publisher of the online publication Science and Diplomacy. Since 2012, Science and Diplomacy has provided a forum for rigorous thought, analysis, and insight to serve stakeholders who develop, implement, or teach all aspects of science and technology. Science, technology, and diplomacy. Kim Montgomery is our executive director. And today's moderator will be William Colglazier, Editor-in-Chief of Science and Diplomacy and a senior scholar of the AAAS Center for Science Diplomacy. He is a former executive officer of the National Academies of Sciences, where he served from 1994 to 2011. Former Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State. He held this position from 2011 to 2014. And former co-chair of the 10-member group at the UN advising on science, technology, and innovation for the 17 Sustainable Development Goals during the 2-year period from 2016 to 2018. And the floor is yours, Bill.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Well, for me, it's a great pleasure to have this distinguished group of 5 individuals who have long experience working inside the World Bank, dealing with many different aspects of science and technology. I enjoyed very much the essays that we published in Science and Diplomacy Online, and just based on the practice session we had for the previous 30 minutes, I think this session is going to be very insightful. When we published their essays in Science and Diplomacy, we asked them these questions. Given your experience at the World Bank, how have science, technology, innovation impacted the World Bank's programs? How have these programs evolved, and what could have been done better? And what would you recommend to the new World Bank President Ajay Banga from a science and technology perspective? And each of them wrote these brief pieces based on that. President Banga is the 14th president of the World Bank Group. He has broad experience in the private sector. He was previously vice chairman of General Atlantic, the private equity company, and is president and CEO of MasterCard. Back in October of last year, he outlined a new vision and mission for the bank. He outlined 8 global challenges: adaptation and mitigation, fragility and conflict, pandemic prevention and preparedness, energy access, food and nutrition security, water security and access, enabling digitalization, and protecting biodiversity and nature. Every one of these issues, as all of you know, have significant aspects related to science and technology. They're important to include. During his first months on the job, he unveiled a number of new initiatives, including a pledge to direct 45% of the bank's lending towards climate-related projects. So he has a very ambitious agenda for the bank. And the bank currently supplies grants and loans to about 100 low and middle income countries. It's opened its doors back in 1946, and when it was created, they helped finance the rebuilding of Western Europe after World War II. I'm going to tell you briefly about the backgrounds of our five speakers. I'll do that all together, and then I'm going to turn to each of them to take about 7 minutes to outline their key ideas addressing all of these questions. Then we'll have another 20 minutes where I will ask them some general questions, and they'll have a little bit more time to answer. Then we will turn it to the last 20 minutes or so for questions, Q&A generated by all of you online. The first to speak will be Sajitha Bashir. She spent her career working in the human development sectors in Africa, Latin America, South Asia, and the Middle East. At the bank, she's a former advisor to the Global Director for Education at the bank, where she created a partnership for skills in applied sciences, engineering, and technology, known as PASET, P-A-S-E-T, and previously headed the National Research and Evaluation Unit of the Government of India's primary education program. The second speaker is Alfred Watkins. Al is the founder and chairman of the Global Solutions Summit, and for the past 6 years is a member of the Governing Council of the UN Technology Bank for the Least Developed Countries. He worked more than 23 years at the bank, spending 6 years as the S&T program coordinator and leader of the bank's STI Global Expert Team. The third speaker is Charles Weiss. Chuck is a distinguished professor emeritus at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He was the first science and technology advisor to the World Bank and is the author of a recent book, The Survival Nexus: Science, Technology, and World Affairs, published by Oxford University Press. Next to the last speaker is Gordon Myers. Gordon recently retired as chief counsel and head of technology business risk of the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. He's presently special advisor, sustainable technology to Valora Stewardship Catalyst LLC, and of counsel to Wave Law PLLC. He is also project lead for the Responsible Technology Initiative of ISLP, a nonprofit and non-governmental organization providing pro bono legal assistance to government, civil society organizations, social enterprises in the global South. And he wants to make clear that the views he expresses are solely his own. Our last speaker is Klaus Helms. He is currently co-chair of the Roundtable on Science and Technology for State Sustainability as the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and a senior advisor on development issues and digital risk management. During his 30-year career at the World Bank, he worked across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, leading programs in infrastructure, knowledge and technology strategy, finance, trade, and competitiveness. So we're very lucky to have talked to these five distinguished people with great experiences to come and share their insights with us today. So let me first turn to Sajitha.
Thank you, Bill, and other colleagues for organizing this important webinar. And I would like to start with two stories which exemplify what the bank has done, what it hasn't done, and conclude with what it can and must do to foster science and technology capacity in developing countries, which are the key messages for President Ajay Banga. My first story is about the World Bank-China partnership, which began close to 45 years ago in 1980. And during this time, China has transformed from a low-income country to an upper-middle-income country, lifting millions out of poverty and emerging as a scientific and technological power. But the first project to launch this collaboration was not a project on economic reform, private sector development, or infrastructure. It was a $200 million project to improve the quality of undergraduate mathematics and science programs in selected Chinese universities and to build science and technology capacity. A small but important component of this project was the establishment of an international advisory panel and a counterpart Chinese review commission, an arrangement through which project universities were introduced to innovations and international standards in science and technology research and teaching, which China adapted and diffused to non-project institutions. And interestingly, this institutional arrangement continued for close to 20 years, up to 1999, with the last World Bank Tertiary Education Project. So this is one story of what the World Bank has done in a country in which it had no prior experience prioritizing science and technology development for 2 decades. And now I turn to the other story, fast forwarding to the early 2000s. President Nelson Mandela was asked by the bank what it could do to help Africa, and his reply was establish the Indian Institutes of Technology, similar institutions in Africa, or like the MIT in the US. Bank did not provide any support for this suggestion. In fact, until then, the bank had just one project on S&T in Africa. It took 10 years for the bank to engage in science and technology on such a large scale in Africa through the Africa Centers of Excellence and the Regional Scholarship and Innovation Fund, PASET, which is the first Pan-African Science Fund. So I've been closely associated with these two bank projects, ACE and the RCIF, since their inception in 2013, when I was education manager for Africa and worked closely with my colleague who worked on West Africa. It was very difficult to get these ideas off the ground. First, a question always arose, mainly from the World Bank country directors, as to whether Africa needed science and technology capacity building and whether the bank should be lending for it, given the high levels of poverty, non-completion of primary education, and so on, i.e. issues of rationale and relevance. The second question was whether the education sector should be engaged in this, given that the economic management sector within the bank dealt with innovation projects, and agriculture, health, and sectoral projects often had their own technology components, i.e. the problem of institutional coordination within the bank. And third, the difficulty of creating regional projects, that is a problem which was related to the bank's primarily country-based lending model, which had made it difficult to address issues of regional capacity building. We did overcome these obstacles, partly due to strong support from the Africa VP at the time, who shared this vision, and the strong demand from African countries. Eventually, the ACE project has become one of the largest investments in the bank on science and technology, with $700 million invested, spread over 20 countries and 70 centers. One of these centers was instrumental in sequencing the genome of the COVID virus during the pandemic. The Regional Science and Innovation Fund had to overcome even more formidable internal opposition because of its novelty. This is a regional science fund, a vision of the African Union since 2005, and the bank initially refused to fund it. The governments of Kenya and governments of Rwanda, to their credit, stepped forward with a $2 million contribution each to show their commitment to building such a fund. And then we were able to mobilize $10 million from the government of Korea and $15 million from the World Bank. Today, this fund has mobilized over $50 million. It supports PhD scholars, postdoctoral research, and innovation grants. It has received applications from close to 8,000 students across sub-Saharan Africa, applying to 15 African universities and partnered with 29 universities from outside the continent. 37% of the scholars are women, and this is in Africa. And I've had the honor of writing about some of their research on locally relevant problems, such as helping farmers to cope with the impacts of climate change using local resources, biological control methods for a range of fungi, using IoT in the informal sectors, and so on. So the message of the Africa story is about that the bank did not do anything for a long time and then took it up and did it on a massive scale, perhaps due to committed individuals and committed governments. But the sustainability of both initiatives and long-term support is still not assured. So I come to the final point, which is what the bank can and must do in the coming period. I think that the bank's investments in science and technology capacity building should not be sporadic and idiosyncratic. There must be deliberate and long-term investment treated as an integral part of development and poverty reduction. Secondly, the bank needs to make clear arguments and have a line of sight between developing science and technology capacity and poverty reduction, climate resilience, and environment sustainability. And the third is that the bank needs to address an organizational lacuna in its current structure in how to coordinate efforts on science and technology. How can the functions of advisory services, decision-making on lending, and knowledge generation and dissemination be organized to provide cohesive leadership for both single country and multi-country projects? So in short, to conclude, developing a clear vision based on sound rationale and creating the appropriate organizational mechanisms will go a long way in helping the bank to put its mark on the new wave of science and technology development for developing countries to address the existential crises that we face. Thank you.
No, so thank you very much, Sujitha. That's very interesting. The right vision and the organizational structure to accomplish it. Next, we'll turn to Al.
Thank you very much, Bill and colleagues and folks in the audience. So I think if we're going to be talking about science and technology at the World Bank, it's useful to start with just a reminder, what is the World Bank's mission and vision statement? And very simply, that mission and vision statement is to, and this is the new version of it promulgated under President Banga, to create a world free of poverty on a livable planet. And so then the question becomes, how can the World Bank fulfill its mission and vision statement? And in particular, how can the World Bank ensure that we progress from results in the lab, science and technology, to results on the ground? Because science and technology doesn't accomplish anything unless it actually transforms people's lives. And I would argue that solutions to many problems exist, but they're not being used on a scale that really solves the problem. And the challenge, especially in the least developed countries, the low-income countries, and the low and middle-income countries, is to use the innovative solutions that are generated by scientists to solve development challenges. This entails, and these are my conclusions, this entails building appropriate R&D capacity coupled with many other indispensable complementary capacities. Scientists are essential in this process of science and technology for development, but scientists alone cannot generate results in the ground, which, as I've said, is the ultimate measure of success. Therefore, for each development challenge that a country faces, not for the country itself, but each development challenge within the country, I think countries should design and implement needs assessments and action plans, or also known as roadmaps, and that these needs assessment and action plans should answer three questions. What STI capacity, both STI and non-STI, do you currently have? What capacity, STI and non-STI, do you need to solve the problem? And how are you going to go about building the necessary capacity? The challenges and objectives that countries face are well known: potable water, off-grid renewable electricity, smart regenerative agriculture, food security, food processing, storage, adding value addition or value addition in mining, manufacturing, services. And another thing which I think is becoming increasingly important is, we have smart factories growing up all around the world, and can you be a dumb supplier to a smart factory? How do you build up the capacity of your local manufacturing and local suppliers to work with the smart value chains that are coming on board? So then the question becomes, what STI capacity are we talking about? And I'm not going to give answers. I'm just simply raising questions in the few minutes that I have available. One, there's new and there's existing technology. So what are we focusing on? Developing new things or using what already exists and learning to use it because it's already available around the world? There's the issue of indigenous technology and locally produced technology, and then non-local technology. 90% of what's available is probably available outside your country, irrespective of what country you're talking about. Then there's whether we should focus on R&D and commercialization, That's one part of the equation. The other part is deploying what's already available. It hasn't been invented in your research lab, but it has to be deployed. And this requires scientists, engineers, and others. So we need to figure out in the roadmap, what is the balance between all of these different dimensions and variables associated with science. And then there's all the complementary things, the non-science things that we need to focus on. What's the role of the government in all this and other stakeholders? Should the government be the doer? Should it be the one who develops the roadmap? Should it be the one that implements it? Or should we talk more closely with stakeholders in all of this and bring them into it? So the role of government versus other stakeholders. There's the issue of technology scouting and technology evaluation. Many technologies are available. Which are best for your country to solve your particular problems given your starting conditions? How do you build capacity in enterprises to use these technologies? The fact that you've invented something doesn't mean that I know how to use it and I need some training. So enterprise capacity building. You need community participation. It's not enough to have a top-down decision about what's needed. You need community participation from a wide range of stakeholders. Scientists, to be sure, business people, to be sure, NGOs, people living in the community. Just, you know, if they're out there, they're some of the stakeholders, they need to be consulted because this is the way you're going to get buy-in and results on the ground. You need to build up local supply chains to use the technology. And then these local supply chains need to be connected to global value chains, to local value chains, to regional value chains. All of this is part of the process of getting results on the ground. And I won't go on more with all of these things, just to say they're essential. And then finally, you need business models. Are you going to use co-ops, franchises, NGOs, social enterprises? What's the rule of public procurement? All of these issues need to be addressed in the roadmaps or the needs assessment and action plans. They're not strictly scientific, but they're essential if you're going to have results on the ground. So recommendations for President Banga very quickly. Help the countries design and implement need assessments and action plans. And that will help break down the silos within the World Bank as well as within the country, because you're going to see all the cross-cutting nature of issues that need to be addressed. The World Bank should be a champion and a facilitator so that the people in the country understand the need for it. And also if the country understands the need for it, then the bank begins to understand so that they don't face some of the problems that Sujita suggested. Last but not least, don't reinvent the wheel. Learn from the World Bank history and disseminate those lessons of experience. And here I would point to Chuck Weiss's book, The World Bank as a Technology Institution, which is a marvelous lesson in how the World Bank did this successfully in many developing countries. Let's learn from it. Yes, it took place 30, 40 years ago, but there are relevant lessons of experience. Help countries adapt and adopt successful programs from the World Bank, US, EU, India, China, Japan, Korea, Rwanda, and others. Lots of people have been successful at doing this. Let's learn from those lessons of experience and disseminate them. And the World Bank should play a role in that. And finally, there's an STI program coordinator role, somebody within the World Bank, who not a centralized position where you dictate to people do this, do that, but rather act as a networker, a knowledge broker, a diplomat, and sort of spread the word and act as a promulgator of these good ideas. And last but not least, leadership from the top. I think within the countries, you need bottom up, you need community consultation, and you need consultation within the World Bank. But ultimately, for the World Bank, in my experience, a mandate from the top, the managing director level, ideally even the presidential level, is essential for making all of this work. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Al. I'm a great fan of roadmaps, and I'm sure we're going to be talking a little bit more about that as well, and the right way to actually create them. Let me turn next now to Chuck Weiss. Chuck, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Bill, and wonderful to hear from Fujita and from Al, from your lips to God's ear. implicit in or explicit in both of these presentations is the idea of some kind of a central focus, some kind of a central stimulating and coordinating focus in the bank to guide this increased effort that we all hope will take place by the bank in science and technology in support of this new mission to abolish poverty in a livable world. Well, I had this job. I had it for 15 years, from 1971 to 1985. It's a long time ago. The world, the bank, technology were all very different then. But my role within the organization was in many ways similar to the role that such an advisor would be likely to have today. So when I left the basic research lab to become the bank's first science and technology advisor, the main work of the bank was in the financing of large infrastructure projects using conventional technology. Then President Robert McNamara had just laid down a novel challenge to this technically skilled but somewhat stodgy financial institution: end poverty without causing environmental damage. He expanded the bank's portfolio to include urban and rural development projects designed to address issues of poverty directly. I realized that the bank was in an excellent position to translate scientific and technological ideas into institutions, into investment projects, and into actual innovations. Now, President Ajay Banga has now set forth an equally important new challenge: ending poverty in a livable world. This challenge, too, requires new thinking, new organizational culture, a good deal of experimentation, and a long time horizon. To meet this challenge means building local scientific and technological capacity to adapt to climate change, to pandemics, to natural disasters, to rapid changes in technology and markets, to the needs of foreign investors, to all the things that Al and Fujita were mentioning. It means working with private industry and with the global scientific community to identify needs for research and innovation on global and regional subjects, and to generate support for those projects that are unlikely to be addressed by private industry. And here we should recall that one of the bank's most enduring contributions was the establishment of the CGIAR, which develops modern agricultural technology for small farmers and diffuses it all over the developing world. My first task as science and technology advisor was to demonstrate the value of a broader view of science and technology. Landsat, NASA's first Earth resources satellite, had just been launched. I commissioned and displayed a composite mosaic of images of the African continent to show the richness of the geographic information it provided. In an unforgettable moment, a senior bank agronomist examined the images, jabbed his finger at a spot in southern Kenya, and announced dramatically, "I planted those trees, and the eland are eating them." Another staff agronomist had already used satellite imagery to demonstrate that a country had tried to cheat the bank by overstating the miles of irrigation canals for which it had asked to be reimbursed. So my first success came when the bank established what eventually grew into its internal center for geographic information centers. As I came to understand the many ramifications of science and technology in the bank's work, my role expanded to include developing new projects to build local scientific and technological capacity, including new forms of innovation funds, applied research labs, and policy measures to encourage technological innovation, suggesting changes to project design to incorporate innovative or so-called appropriate technology, which was more or less what is called inclusive technology today, proposing plans for research and innovation on global problems affecting developing countries, promoting, defending, and publicizing the techno-economic research on innovative technology that was already being undertaken by bank staff on subjects like low-cost housing and sewerage and labor-intensive construction of feeder roads, developing policy ideas and guidelines for incorporating science and technology policy into analyses of national economies and economic sectors, and for incorporating innovative technology and technology policy into projects, sponsoring regular seminars and training courses to keep bank staff up to date on the latest developments, and keeping in touch with the many technologically oriented non-governmental organizations that at the time were the major sources and users of what would today be called inclusive approaches to technology. Added to these were the usual tasks of science diplomacy, keeping in touch with the scientific community, with developments on a broad range of technologies, and with the activities of other aid agencies and multilateral organizations, and most notably, presentation to writing the bank's presentation to the United Nations Mega Conference on New and Renewable Energy. All of these functions are likely to be features on the work of any future science and technology advisor. I strongly second the suggestion of my fellow panelists that the bank needs both a formal policy and a central organizational focus for its work in science and technology. In the absence of a clear policy statement by bank management that science and technology are important elements of the bank's mission, good ideas that challenge established approaches or that go against the prevailing bureaucratic culture may be dismissed on the grounds that we don't do that kind of thing. The central focus could take the form of an advisor with a staff, a budget for travel and consultants, and perhaps an outside advisory committee. On the other hand, it may require creating an independent foundation that can make grants for research and innovation, can collaborate with private industry, and carry out in a flexible manner some of the ideas that have been already proposed and hopefully will come out of this section, this webinar. By the way, the bank briefly considered a proposal for such a foundation in the 1980s. In sum, my message to President Banga is that mobilizing science and technology is critical to the bank's new mission of helping to bring about a livable world free of poverty. The bank has tremendous potential by dint of its unique combination of money, knowledge, global overview, freedom of action, convening power, and involvement in the design and financing of major investment projects. On the other hand, some of the aspects of its structure impede the effectiveness of its work, of the potential for this work in science and technology, and need to be re-examined if the bank is going to make the kind of major contribution of which it is capable. I urge Mr. Banga to realize this potential by making science and technology a centerpiece of the bank's work, the subject of an explicit policy, a priority to its staff, an essential part of the image that the bank projects to the world. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chuck. Also, for those of you who are interested, I highly recommend Chuck's book. Now let's turn to Gordon.
Thanks very much, Bill and Steph. Look, thanks very much again for this very kind invitation and the real privilege of addressing these important issues. You know, as Bill mentioned, I come from IFC, the private sector side of the institution. And from the risk side of that institution, I was also, lead counsel for IFC's private equity impact and venture fund investing practices. So I might have a slightly different take on the proverbial elephant than my esteemed friends from the bank itself. So again, all views and errors are solely my own. Let me take a moment to lay out some thinking about the world as it is. One, IFC has been key to scaling new technologies, such as cellular technologies and digital solutions in a number of sectors. It has, however, been most comfortable taking commercial risk and not risk on the underlying technologies themselves. Two, development progress in complex areas like climate mitigation and vaccines will increasingly depend on understanding of complex science-based solutions. And IFC as patient capital with very different risk-sharing tools, and will inevitably be asked to take more technology risk in its investments. And I think you're beginning to see already really many of the development finance institutions, bilateral and multilateral, standing at a fire hose of investment opportunities from the venture community in particular. And third, and not least, we live in a kind of nationalist, populist, and fragmented world with diminishing trust in science, technology, and public institutions, frankly, probably including the World Bank Group, and more risk as well that potentially beneficial technologies will have military uses as well, or be misused by bad actors. And yet, IFC is also being asked to increase its investment volumes on limited resources to achieve its new and broader mandate. So how can we fairly ask IFC to kind of do everything everywhere all at once, build its impact exponentially, understand a new environment of constant technological change, and manage new potentially severe risks to the very populations it intends to benefit? Well, I think part of the answer is that when change is constant, governance is everything. This means, I think, that IFC requires state-of-the-art technology decision structures in its investment advisory operations, perhaps modeled on evolving NIST and similar governance and risk governance frameworks. These frameworks typically include mechanisms to proactively identify new technology opportunities and solutions, identify and prioritize associated technology risks, and guide the board to adopt defined, transparent priorities, risk tiers, and risk appetites for corporate investment activities. These tasks don't really fall neatly into commercial operations, business decisions, or even risk decisions. In fact, I think they may well define more or less the role of a science and technology advisor, or perhaps a chief science officer in a triple bottom line development organization like IFC. So how can effective science and technology governance mechanisms be developed? One proposal might be for an IFC science advisor to work with key client and donor countries such as India and South Korea, and with established government agencies who have successfully developed programs that translate science and values to practical solutions with commercial partners. Other easy wins to build IFC's capacity might include upskilling of staff, management, and even board capacity to manage science more effectively, integrating effective and responsible science guidance into IFC project approval and portfolio management processes, and ensuring that IFC's very exciting anticipated impact measurement and monitoring, or it's called AIM, ratings framework rewards staff for responsible, sustainable, and urgent technology adoption by IFC clients. And finally, as a global institution not subject to any national regulation, IFC might work with its partners to develop effective standards for new technologies that haven't been regulated yet, and that transparently communicate risk appetite for projects and build consensus in the relevant stakeholder communities. As with similar internal initiatives, such as IFC's upstream pilot, IFC could begin with a small centralized effort to leverage available internal expertise into a coherent operational approach with accountability to a committee of IFC's board of directors and a defined deadline to mainstream technology risk decision-making to its operational departments over time. This mechanism could evolve into a more permanent IFC's resource. And I hesitate to use the word centralized. It's really would adopt a structure of a global lead, possibly based in one of the regions, with other regional leads and champions. Or even, it might even be spun out as a separate body outside outside of any specific development finance institution. A separate body would indeed support coordinated DFI efforts to understand and maximize the benefits of science and technology for development and help develop coordinated roadmaps for efficient and sustainable private sector involvement in scaling these activities. And I think this would be a substantial advance in the capacity and credibility of the development community to meet its increasingly challenging science and technology mandate. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gordon. IFC is one aspect of the bank that I was least familiar with, so that was very interesting and enlightening.
Yeah.
Last turn to Klaus.
Thank you very much, Bill. And it's great to be part of this panel. I wish I had been at the bank when Chuck was there. I think I've talked and worked with everyone else. So I think, not surprisingly, we probably are coming up with very similar sounding suggestions. So when Bill asked this question, I was sort of going back in my memory file to sort of pull out 3 examples that might illustrate my strong commitment to the S&T agenda. The first one has to do with capacity. The second one has to do with brokering and mobilizing knowledge. And the third one has to do with leveraging technology and experimentation. So going back to the mid-1990s, the World Bank actually did have a bit of a crisis because this was the time you may remember when many infrastructure sectors and utilities were being privatized and broken up. And the World Bank's policy advice called for the creation of independent regulatory agencies, except we had very few regulators on staff, and we actually even knew less about how to manage and set up these new entities. So one idea was to actually start working with public utility research centers, in this case, the University of Florida, and to develop a peer-to-peer learning course for newly appointed utility regulators. And Lord and behold, this program has been running on a self-financing basis for the last 26 years. More than 4,000 utility regulators have participated in this course. And in some way, this type of hands-on learning is exactly the type of capacity building that I think my colleagues have already mentioned. I think it is particularly important in areas with rapidly evolving international standards and other SMT areas. The second example, maybe even more relevant, it dates back to the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And while everyone was talking about the need to mobilize funding, the managing director at that time, Graham Wheeler, actually had a different take on it. He said this crisis will subside, but what will not subside is the demand for a new type of knowledge from developing countries that are looking for new solutions to deal with this crisis. And he constituted a 3-people knowledge strategy group to rethink and overhaul the bank's traditional and in some way very state approach to knowledge. And we came up over the course of 2 years with 3 ideas that in some they don't sound dramatic, but they actually had quite important significance. The first one was to open up the bank's entire development data repository free of charge for the rest of the world. And many APIs have since been built on this. And if you ask President Zelig about his proudest accomplishments, I would say he would probably list this as one of them as being most significant. The second proposal was to open the banks up to knowledge partnerships with outside organizations. At that time sounded pretty much revolutionary, but I think, of course, now has become much more commonplace. And the third one was to tackle some of the organizational silos within the organization itself, to build cross-cutting teams. And Al was the leader of one of those expert teams on STI, because we really recognized, even at that time, that unless we really bring sort of cross-cutting teams together, STI as a new discipline really doesn't have a chance to take off. And in the last few years, and that's my third point, was leveraging digital technologies for ushering in innovative solutions. And we were very closely involved with using digital for financial inclusion, for building global momentum around digital ID for everyone. We worked with innovation teams funded by grants from many bilateral donors in the areas of agribusiness, technology adoption. Many of the iHubs and InfoDev hubs that were started were actually coming out of that time. And what really struck home was the need not just to have an understanding around technology, but also to find ways of locally adapting it to pilots, working often with local universities. So building on those three examples, I have three suggestions to make. The first one is to engage with the global science community to address these challenges. And I mean specifically, do not underestimate the amount of hesitancy and almost anxiety on the part of global science to engage with the World Bank and vice versa. It's almost like this needs matchmaking at a very high level. I remember talking to I think leaders of the International Science Council, for instance, they were asking, what would it take for us to be in access to senior bank leadership, to the board, to really broker these connections? And I can think of other organizations, NIH, NIST, the inter-academic partnerships. I think these are definitely strangers to the World Bank, but I think they really would be the type of leverage and the type of connectors that the bank definitely and desperately benefit from. And a chief science advisor would be exactly that type of connector. The second one is, and that goes to this whole point of the rapid pace of scientific discoveries and technological change has created an unbelievable demand for knowledge and applications. And I think a challenge for President Banga would be to really issue a global call to reimagine capacity building and learning at scale, using technologies and really making this knowledge much more widely available, really as a public good. And the third one is, and this again goes to our understanding of the way the bank works or doesn't work, is we need new mechanisms to transfer and adapt these science and technologies into strategies and programs at the country and global and regional level. My colleague Naoto Kanehira and I and a few others worked on the STI for SDG guidebook. And this was really as part of the UN technology facilitation mechanism. It was really an effort from our side to bring the planning around STI strategies into development process and into national development planning, something that the World Bank should be and needs to be much more familiar with, and something that really urgently needs to be given much more prominence. At this point, it is really just a handful of countries that are piloting this: Kenya, India, Serbia, Ukraine, Ghana. And the amount of attention and demand that that little pilot has created has been really quite phenomenal. And I think it would be my strong hope and suggestion to really bring STI roadmaps and plans much more to the benefit of low-income countries. Keep in mind, the government spending on R&D in low-income countries is 65 times less than in high-income countries. In other words, the gap is just growing. It is not diminishing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Klaus. As Klaus knows, I'm also a big fan of the STI for SDGs roadmaps. All 5 presentations I found very illuminating and insightful, and I think the most useful thing I can do is to give each of them 4 or 5 minutes more to say their remarks, and I'll kind of lay out some themes, but they're free to pick and choose or to focus on something else. First of all, as we all know, we're all painfully aware of, the world has changed significantly in the last 4 or 5 years. Now we have major conflicts going on around the world. We had to deal with the pandemic. We have this rapid acceleration of emerging technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, AI, which is now potentially transforming the business world and many business operations. How is the bank thinking about how it has to deal with and help countries to navigate in this new environment? Talked about roadmaps, ways to bring in all stakeholders in a country, working with the bank to actually prioritize their strategies for working over time to accomplish their goals. Some of Sajisa's examples of how to deal with the problem of having the bank listen more to what the countries want. The middle income countries right now see the importance of science and technology capacity building, but trying to get the bank to help develop lowest income countries to also prioritize their long-term strategies, the kind of things that help revolutionize progress in a number of countries that have been great successes of the bank's involvement over time. Then also the bureaucratic issues, how to structure it inside the bank, to have a science advisor. Maybe it's to create new sort of a science and technology innovation knowledge strategy group, the kind of things that Klaus talked about earlier, to try to cut down some of the silos inside the bank to help focus on these needs that require expertise from many different parts of the bank, as well as expertise from outside the bank as well. And then what Gordon talked about, the risk profile and dealing with helping with the investments of the private sector to be able to accomplish the needs of of developing countries. And lastly, because I think about when the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship Program with the when about 1972, about the time that Chuck started at the bank, and the strategy there in part was to increase the number of young people who had the opportunity to get the experience working inside an institution. In this case, it was the U.S. government, all its agencies, and the U.S. Congress. That would be one way over time to create a larger capacity inside the U.S. government to deal with science and technology innovation issues. Does the bank have adequate mechanisms bringing in people, not only economists, but people that also have expertise in all these different areas that you all have talked about? So anyway, pick and choose among the issues, but you could also comment on some of the things that your colleagues have said in their remarks as well. How best to accomplish what I think one of you said was, with the right vision and the right governance mechanism. Those are easy to say, but hard to accomplish in practice. What is the best strategy for actually trying to move forward on all these things and having the World Bank become an even more effective partner with developing countries and addressing the issues that are important to all of us. So each of you have about 4 to 5 minutes to make additional comments, and I'll go in the same order, turning first to Sajitha.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Well, I won't address all those issues, but let me perhaps address the issue of the organizational structure. And I just want to say that I have a lot of sympathy for my former colleagues who are in the trenches, the task team leaders and the managers, the program leaders, and so on, who have to deal with developing the portfolio and actually delivering loans and supervising them. And therefore suggesting more, and having lived through 3 organizational restructurings, these are not very pleasant or interesting things necessarily, and one doesn't always see the impact. So however, this issue is so important that I think, before we get to a question of, what is the appropriate organizational structure, we could think of a few interim measures, which some colleagues have touched upon. For instance, having a high-level discussion forum, engagement with outside scientific organizations, with including from the developing countries, international organizations as well as national ones, but really understanding what are the trends, exposing bank staff, bank managers, and others to the trends that are there in the world, how the world of science is changing, and what impact it has on future development of countries. I think there's a huge relevance for this kind of activity. The second is perhaps to designate a few of the practices as they were called earlier, I suppose they're still called that, as the primary ones where science and technology capacity could be built. For instance, it could be the economic unit dealing with innovation, or it could be the digital development practice or the education practice. Maybe not everybody has to be involved initially, but there could be smaller coordinating groups amongst key practices that would be helping to develop the science and technology capacity, maybe reviewing the progress of different components and different projects. Well, I mean, there are many things that such a group could do. And then I think finally the question of how to recruit young people who have this background. And of course, a bank is primarily consists of economists, young economists, but one could have a kind of merging of skills at the entry level, people who have studied science and technology policy, or who have done economics, but also with a focus on science and technology, or just, young scientists who have an interest in development. And bring in these young people to really infuse new thinking at the grassroots level. We were talking about a possible fellowship program for, putting young scientists into the bank. And there are many good examples of these. The question is always of funding and management and making sure they have an impact. So these are some of my suggestions. I would say that the bank has to go through this process of understanding what's going on before trying to do a major organizational kind of intervention that may backfire sometimes because people don't understand what that is about. Thanks.
No, thank you, Sujitha. Very, very wise suggestions. Al.
Well, thank you very much. I have 2 or 3 points I'll just briefly highlight. One, I think when you look at the role of science and technology for the SDGs, for meeting the World Bank's mission and vision statement, start with the problem you're trying to solve. As I said, and you've got each country has many different problems. And for each problem, you need to ask these questions of how can science and technology help? What do we mean by science and technology in terms of what sort of research, what sort of scientific capacity, what sort of additional ancillary complementary capacity you need, and how you put all of these things together. The countries need to do this, and then the World Bank needs to be able to support the countries in helping them do this, or get out of the way, or just let it go on and don't be involved in it. But either way, the countries need to start the process, I think, by figuring out what their problems are and how they want to go about starting their problems. And they could learn from others who've already gone through this successfully and unsuccessfully and start the process. But this is what I think is absolutely essential to get the ball rolling. What's the problem? How do you want to solve it? And then who are the best people to bring in to help you solve it? In terms of the World Bank's organization, I had the title of Science and Technology Program Coordinator. I always sort of laughed at the title because there was no science and technology program, specific program that existed. And I had no authority to tell anybody what to do. So there was no program, I didn't coordinate anything, but my job was to try to go out and create business. And say, hey, I can help you with this problem, I can help you with that problem, and act opportunistically. And I still think in many ways, find the market and then figure out how best to meet the demands of that market is a good way to start thinking about these issues. I was at a meeting with Graham Wheeler, who is the managing director. I work closely with Graham Wheeler. Klaus mentioned Graham as somebody who was leading this effort, and it was a great privilege to work with Graham and Klaus and others on this thing. And we had a meeting with Dr. Ramesh Mishelkar from India, and he was the head of the Global Research Alliance. And he said to Graham Wheeler, he said, I represent an organization with 40,000 scientists and engineers. how do we work together? With 40,000 scientists, you've got problems, I've got capacity. There's got to be a way to figure out how to work together on solving this. It wasn't a question of money, it was a question of figuring out how we were going to do this, how we were going to solve this. It wasn't easy to find an answer, but I remember at one point Graham turned to me and says, we ought to organize, somebody in the bank ought to organize a conference on how we work together with all these outside groups, scientists, engineers, and many others, on how to address this issue of the World Bank working with others. And that was one of the things we did together. Unfortunately, Graham left, things sort of fizzled out, but it's something that needs to be reignited. And finally, I would say, really and truly, learn from others, the World Bank and the countries. Just in the United States, and I know the United States is sui generis in many ways, but you have the Manufacturing USA Institutes, you have the Manufacturing Extension Partnerships. These are programs designed to help people figure out how science can help them solve problems and how you build the capacity in organizations to use science. So how do we deal with all of these issues? These are the kind of things that the bank and the countries need to address. And the bank needs to figure out how to do this. I don't have the answer, but I just think if we all put our heads together, we'll get the answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. In fact, your position of the bank reminded me of mine as the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State. No real authority, no real program, but a mandate to go out and try to find what the needs were and how to figure out ways that to be helpful. So let's see. Next, we have Chuck.
Well, I'm hearing the story of my life. My strategy at the time, starting from scratch, was to initiate as many new things as I could think of, help as many people as I could, do as many things as I could, and hope that the aggregate of all of these activities would create a feeling in the bank that this stuff is really important and we ought to do more of it. That meant pushing a big rock uphill each time. There was always somebody in the middle of the management hierarchy that said, we don't do this kind of stuff. I got other things to do. I've got priorities of this and that. And there were structural issues having to do with not having a grant facility, not being able to do small projects. And that's what gives me pause about the recommendation to start small. You can start small and never get to be big because you're bucking a lot of things. It's terribly important to change the self-image of the bank, to have management say, look, this stuff is important. The world has changed and we really have to do more of it. And we have to do it systematically. And we have to look at how we're structured. And everybody who's got an idea, give it a try. And if it doesn't work, okay, that's life. And if it works, we'll try it on a larger scale. One possible model is the way that McNamara introduced his ideas of rural development and then urban development, and then later how the bank reorganized to make environment a more systematic element of its projects. McNamara established basically a pilot organization with his full support to develop a totally new kind of project in rural development instead of big irrigation, big infrastructure projects that had a strong sociological basis. Had various problems, but I shouldn't go into it. Later, he did the same thing with urban. And when the first generation or the second generation of projects had been developed and you sort of knew what you were doing, you diffused these projects and incorporated them into the regional structure that existed at the time. And later, the environmental program or the issue evolved in the same way. At the beginning, there was a review process where a staff looked at projects in process of formation and advised it, or they had real veto power. They became very unpopular. Later, environment was incorporated and integrated into country programming, into project analysis, and every division had environmental responsibilities. You integrated it into the organization, but that was done on a predetermined time schedule. You knew that was going to happen. And there has to be some combination of the bottom-up stuff. Let's try it. Let's see what works. But these, in my history and in the histories that we just heard, these required heroic bureaucratic entrepreneurship. You had to keep fighting for this project and getting it to work and overcoming those obstacles. Should be, insofar as we can, we should try to eliminate those. I have a whole book on innovation, technological innovation in legacy sectors, which was born out of my experience. One other thing I wanted to mention, one of the things that we did was to develop a course in science and technology for development for science advisors in developing countries. And the beautiful thing about this is that after I left, my staff continued it for many years, gave it dozens of times, eventually became a publication in a journal, building on the best of bank projects, project experience on how to integrate science and technology and how to into an investment project and how to scale it up. And this influenced a large number of science advisors and science people that were integrated into government operations. The idea of a fellow, Bill mentioned the AAAS fellowships, which insert young scientists or mid-level, mid-career scientists into various government organizations. I think that's a swell idea. That's a really good idea to have several good young scientists or engineers just put someplace in the bank and let them figure out interesting things to do. It's worked very nicely in the U.S. government. I think it's a great idea for the bank.
Thank you, Chuck, and you've wisely reminded us that we can't only start small, but because there are big bureaucratic obstacles in trying to move forward in a significant way, although it doesn't negate the importance of having a number of small initiatives too that can lead to bigger things. Next, Gordon.
Thanks, Bill. As you probably know, one of the keys in life is to answer the question that you're prepared to answer rather than the question that was directly asked. So, but Steph had sent around some very interesting questions the other night and very thought-provoking. And I just want to pull a couple of points out from that. One is, in terms of bringing young people in, I really think this is a great opportunity to call out the fact that there are really, in terms of success factors, there are younger junior and regional staff who really have contributions to make even today. And, even the lawyers that started to come into the organization have coding experience or an engineering background, and they're interested in development challenges, and that's why they're here. And, they have great skills. They want to make sort of good trouble. And I think they're valuable resources. Two of the most interesting projects that I've seen over the last couple of years, one is Startup Catalyst, which operates on delegated authority from the board to invest in incubators and accelerators that are often associated with universities. And another project that really brings together small technology companies and larger IFC clients to see if they can make the technology jump to real commercialization. Those were really originated by young people with engineering backgrounds, cooperating with lawyers, cooperating with ESG to develop solutions. The second thing is just to build on what Klaus was saying about an open bank. Having an open IFC is really both a huge opportunity and a big challenge. IFC sits on an absolutely unique reservoir of data and information from 70 years of work with the private sector. Most of that, is is subject to confidentiality in one way or another. And, that trust is part of IFC's license to operate. So how to use data science, how to use technology to convert private data into a public good is, I think, critically important. And this is where a science advisor would really matter, because I know I have a friend over at the Office of Science and Technology Policy. He does a lot of work on data masking, data anonymization, and those technologies have not fully made their way, into the World Bank Group. Now, fortunately, there are some. We did GEMS, a credit database, and Milena, an AI-assisted ESG tool, that have overcome those problems in some way. But that's really a rich area where good science advice could be used. In terms of the demand, I mean, my view from a private sector institution is that actually to some extent, some people have greatness thrust upon them. There's a fire hose of venture, particularly in this environment, of venture technology people looking for money, looking for support. And the real issue is not exciting demand, but whether we can manage technology well. And that includes identifying the right priorities for the institution, and it also includes identifying the risks. So the risk that I can think of that one of the development institutions was not prepared to address was 2 years ago. It was completely foreseeable that dual-use technologies would become a substantial concern, requiring both understanding of the technologies themselves and lawyers who could make that jump. And, as is usual with big bureaucracies, they waited for the crisis to happen instead of planning to see what was the train coming down the track. And I guess the last thing I wanted to talk about was collaboration between science, between the scientific community and the World Bank. And, well, I'm a lawyer, right? So I don't always believe in tea and cookies, I sometimes believe that people have a voice and should take that voice. And I believe the scientific community has a voice and should take that voice and should advocate for establishment of a scientific advisory board to the World Bank Group. Should, if it doesn't, set up an independent institution to make sure that there's a voice out there. And maybe on a more limited scale, for example, look for candidates, IFC is a very active program to appoint members to boards of directors of new companies, members of advisory committees of new funds, and to ensure that appropriate members of the scientific community are within the community, people who get appointed to those positions. So I hope that's useful. It wasn't exactly what you asked, but it's what I had to say.
You did exactly what I hoped you would do, and that provided interesting comments on a range of issues. Our last speaker is Klaus.
Thanks very much. So 3 or 4 points. The first one is you need to make it a burning platform. So if you don't, it's going to dissipate in the organization. That means the president, the board really need to take this on. They need to have a discussion on this. And without this personal leadership, I think it's not going to make a heck of a difference. Because there's a lot going on. I mean, I can just flip this around and sort of say the bank is doing a lot in science and technology, CGIAR, in health, in education. But for some reason, and for reasons that will come to in a second, it really is not sort of the key burning platform that it needs to be. The second, the second suggestion would be to actually focus on something that the bank is really strong on, which is analytics. The World Bank spends approximately $1 billion a year on analytics, its own analytics that are being done by countries. It would be really interesting and worthwhile to have a meta-evaluation in terms of where science and technology currently stands. In preparing for today's discussion, I looked at recent publications by the International Science Council. They have done some really interesting, relevant work, canvassing scientists around the world in terms of where are the scientific gaps. They have come up with this concept of mission-driven science. There is the Global Sustainability Development Report. These are sort of gems in terms of material analytics that we can actually build on, the World Bank could actually build on and actually turn over and sort of say, well, that is really useful entry points for addressing some of these global challenges that we talked about. The third one is some of us know about the work of the International Institute for Analytics. I'm not sure whether I get it now right, but it's basically an initiative around these reports around the world in 2050, TWI 2050. And this report has really put out 6 transformative challenges that distinguish themselves by cutting across sectors, across domains. These really refer to human capacity, consumption and production, decarbonization, food, nutrition, water, urban, peri-urban and mobility, and of course, global environmental and human commons. I think what the bank is always struggling with is to organize its intellectual and financial firepower to really cut across these domains. So I would say we need to define a different relevant agenda that really addresses the multiplicity and the interlinkages of these topics. And the final point, you were asking about demand from countries. Sajita and I just came back from a digital diagnostic mission in Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka is in the depth of a fundamental crisis, basically has been undoing 10 years of or more of progress. And has defaulted on its external debt. Nevertheless, one of its key reform areas is setting up an AI institute. And I would say the amount of attention and the amount of interest around artificial intelligence and digitalization in developing countries, is particularly low-income countries, is unbelievably high because they see the potential. And I don't think that the bank currently is yet in a position to really respond to that. So to me, that would be a really interesting topic to address. How do you scale up this response to demand around artificial intelligence and some other machine learning technologies? And then since Chuck is really sort of the World Bank has had only 3 science advisors in its entire history. Yourself, Bob Watson, and Al Watson. I think for all the economists that have passed through the World Bank, I think it would be a really strong signal to finally appoint somebody or maybe a team to lead this agenda forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Klaus, and to all 5 of you. If a new strategy group for dealing with these issues was set up at the bank, I can't think of any better group than the 5 of you to do that. I'm going to turn now to Stephanie, and she's going to provide some of the questions that have been asked in the Q&A function. So, Stephanie.
Thank you, Bill. We have a few questions right now, so I'm going to read them all, so panelists will have a chance to answer whichever they consider. One is about what is the World Bank doing about the fast AI growth in all industries? This phenomenon will change the financing systems and business models very soon. And the second question is, it takes time and consistent funding to build S&T capabilities in countries. What would it take for the World Bank to design and support long-term S&T programs for the Global South? Another question is, in the context of the ongoing Russian war in Ukraine, with its significant STI potential, how can the World Bank provide capacity support for STI sector, leverage its experience and facilitates expertise transfer and partnerships for resilient and sustainable recovery? We have more questions coming in. Another question is, what role does science education, especially in developing countries, play in all of these, and how can the World Bank and its partners help? And the last one is, President Banga's overarching slogan has been scale, speed, replicability in financing. Building S&T capabilities in and out through heroic bureaucratic entrepreneurship would take patience and tolerance. What lessons can be useful in this cultural balancing act?
Thank you, Stephanie. We'll give each of you 2 minutes. You could pick out of the questions that were asked or ask the question you think that should have been asked. So it'll sort of be your parting shots at these issues. But the questions were good and interesting ones. So if we don't mind going in the same order, so Geetha, you get to lead off.
Okay, let me take a couple of the questions, the one on sustainability and the one on science education, just briefly. I think that's a really valid point about sustainability. We need a long-term horizon, 20, 30 years for building capacity. And as the China example showed, that's exactly what the bank did. And what I would be worried about for Africa, for instance, on the Centers of Excellence or the Pan-African Science Fund, the Regional Scholarship and Innovation Fund, is, whether the bank would continue after a few years because the bank has 5-year project, timeframes, and then everything becomes susceptible to whether the new country director, the new VP, etc., want this or not. And so I think, fortunately, these two projects have continued for a little while, but I think there are two issues. Therefore, this is why it's really important for the bank to consider science and technology development to be part of public goods, to address the other public goods that we need to create, like climate resilience and environmental sustainability, a livable planet, reduced inequality. All these things are now, a question of public goods, and science and technology capacity development has to be part of that. On the bank side, this means, how can we mobilize some more grant financing for this, for at least the IDA countries, but also have maybe other instruments that could allow us to engage on a longer term basis. But on the African side, and perhaps on the broader developing countryside, I think they also need to put pressure to demand this and to say this is absolutely essential. This came up during COVID, the question of vaccinations, the question of testing facilities and ability to sequence the genome. But let's not let that crisis pass. The African countries must also incorporate, this demand for science and technology, and the poorer countries must raise it in the board, must put that forward. I think this is also part of the solution. On the question of science education, I think the bank is incorporating quite a lot in its current education projects. In fact, at one stage, we had even got some trust fund from the Japanese government to improve the quality of science education. But it's an important issue that you need the pipeline of young scientists coming from lower secondary and upper secondary education. And that is an issue in poorer countries. So this is an area that the bank has to continue to work on. Thanks.
Next is Al.
Thank you. I'll answer one question that wasn't asked, but I think is important just to highlight. The role of the job that I had or that Chuck had, science and technology program coordinator type of person. Now, a main difference between Chuck and me is he's a scientist, I am not. I'm an economist by training, and a fallen economist in many people's eyes. But in any event, when I was science and technology program coordinator, Bob Watson was the chief scientist. And people ask, well, what's the difference? And I said, if you want to talk about scientific issues with a scientist, you call Bob Watson. If you want to talk medical issues with the chief medical officer, you call Ak Pannenberg. And if you want to talk about getting the World Bank involved in science and technology capacity building, call me. Because I'm not the scientist, I can't help you with science. The World Bank is not a science organization. The chief scientist worked with other science organizations. I also coordinated with them, but I was not the chief scientist. My job mostly was to operationalize or try to help operationalize scientific insights for issues related to growth, development, sustainability, so on and so forth. So I think it's important to keep that distinction in mind. There's two questions which come from very different perspectives, but I think the answer is the same. One is science and technology for the global South, and the other is science and technology for Ukraine, which is not really the global South. It's a scientifically very advanced industrial country, more or less. In each case, the question becomes, what role do you foresee for science and technology in helping you solve your problems? Issues for the global South may relate to things like off-grid electricity, food storage, so on and so forth. We know how to solve those problems. You don't need to invent new things. You may invent new things. We know how to solve those problems. And if you look at some of the work that's going on by scientists, by engineers, there's new inventions coming online all the time. Empower a Billion Lives, for example, sponsored by IEEE, for off-grid electricity in microgrids, those sorts of things. So the question then is, how do you use those? How do you figure out which one is best for you? And okay, now I have the innovation, I have the invention. How do I deploy it at scale so that it solves the problem? That's the issue of scalability and replicability and speed that President Banga was referring to. That's not a science problem. It is a replicability problem. It's a deployment problem. It involves science, it involves engineering, but it involves so many others. In Ukraine, there's two questions. One that I've been working with Bill and Yulia Berezhenko, who asked the question, which is, how do we connect Ukrainian science with global science in the midst of war? That's a relatively unique sort of question, given the fact that Ukraine can be on the cutting edge of so many scientific advancements. But the other question, which becomes then very similar to what you ask in the global South, is how are you going to rebuild Ukraine after the war? How are you going to rebuild the cities? Are you going to rebuild them exactly the way they were? Are you going to employ new technology for smart cities, so on and so forth? And that involves building institutions, similar institutions to what you might build in the global South, but each one answering slightly different questions. But I think we need to sort of figure out what the problem is and how we're going to build the institutions within the country, and then what the World Bank role in facilitating the building of those institutions might be. So thank you.
Thanks, Al. And for Chuck, Gordon, and Klaus, we'll have to be brief, unfortunately, because we may get cut off in the middle. But Chuck.
Okay, talk fast. Long-term stuff. Bank can do it if it wants to do it. It certainly did it in China. They and in Korea as well. Similarly, Ukraine, very sophisticated place. Bank helped Korea and China recover from various things. They could do it if they want to, and Ukraine probably will ask. Big issue: incentives on bank staff. If you make this part of the bank's self-image, one of the things that will happen is that bank staff will support ideas. If it's too foreign to the way the bank normally does business, I strongly recommend the idea of a foundation that can do it. We need advocates among the scientific community that understand what the bank is doing and how it could do more. AAAS is a possible focus for that kind of an effort, but somebody said that the scientists don't understand what the bank does or how they can link with it. in addition to the mission-oriented things that Al Watkins was talking about, there is a need in poor countries for some general infrastructure, things like geological surveys, applied research laboratories, and so on, which lend themselves to a traditional bank project structure, but doesn't really happen often enough. I think that's enough for a minute and a half.
Thanks, Chuck. Gordon.
Okay. I see that Stefania has said we can go a couple minutes over, so I won't go quite as fast, Chuck, because maybe I come from Texas or something. But I'd like to touch on just 2 points. One is the question of AI. Okay, AI is a classic case where there is fantastic work being done at the bank, at IFC, at MEGA, okay, on AI issues. Responsible, efficient, people trying to think this problem through. Somehow, that has not coalesced into a group risk statement or group standards. And here is something where the bank group should be taking the lead on setting a risk appetite in the absence of regulation. And now it's going to take a backseat. A similar thing happened, by the way, with privacy, where we still haven't applied, or IFC still has not applied privacy standards in its underlying investments. So to have a chief science advisor who can catalyze the need to develop coordinated approaches is, I think, very important. The second thing is I wanted to talk about Ukraine, not so much as in Ukraine, but I think that science and technology policy has to be viewed as an essential part, and I use these words advisedly, of the day after, right? Every country has terrific human capital. Much of it is educated human capital at this point. I have a friend who is trying to set up a venture fund in Ethiopia because the quality of innovation in Ethiopia is very good. And so I feel very much in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Ethiopia, and in other countries, some form of science and technology policy belongs in any day after strategy. Those are my 3 points.
Thank you, Gordon. And Klaus, you get the last word.
Thanks very much. I mean, a lot of wise suggestions. I think the first one is very much linked to this new mission statement and to these what has now become a set of 6 global development challenges. The World Bank needs to mobilize money because right now it's only 5% of all global research that is multilateral in nature. In other words, most of the money on R&D is spent domestically or bilaterally. So if the World Bank really wants to make a dent on some of those global challenges, it's really important to pair this with a dedicated funding amount. And I think certainly during my career, I have seen the ebbs and unfortunately mostly the flow going down when it comes down to funding this type of research. The second one is, and that picks up on Gordon's point about the risk appetite. The World Bank is not a leader when it comes down to technology, but it is really important that the World Bank doesn't get behind the curve, particularly around science and technology. The amount of mistrust, misinformation, disinformation around science is a serious risk factor that is going to endanger a lot of what will certainly become a much more technology-driven revolution in the next 10 years. It's really important that the bank understands that and really understands the importance of building the capacities to push up against this. I think otherwise we will just see a reversal and a deepening skepticism around the role of science and technology in development. And I'm very happy that one of the questions was related to Ukraine. I think what we have learned in the National Academy, certainly I've benefited from seeing these initiatives to build up the SEED Fund, which is science and engineers in exile and displacement, really putting a marker down in terms of science is a difficult, dangerous profession. And it is not just in Ukraine, it's also in many other countries, Afghanistan being one of them. I think it's important to understand this as one of the aspects of conflict. And there is a group out there that especially is not, it's the engineers that are really working towards working in conflict zones. Those are groups that the bank would really benefit from because they bring, like IEEE, an enormous amount of expertise globally to come up with really practical solutions. So I think, again, to re-emphasize this point about partnerships in times of crisis, I think are really most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you to all five of you. It's been a very rich discussion, and the video is going to be posted in a few days, and I think there'll be a number of other people who couldn't be with us today who will benefit from listening to it. So thank you all again, and thanks to Stefania and to Katie and to Kim, my colleagues at in the Center for Science Diplomacy involved in the journal.
And thank you for setting it up.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.